The snow fell in thick, silent curtains across the Ardennes forest. December 1944. The air itself seemed to freeze mid-breath. In a shallow foxhole carved into frozen earth, Private First Class Daniel Hargrove pressed his cheek against the cold wood stock of his M1903 Springfield, his breath forming ghostly clouds that threatened to give away his position. Somewhere across that white wilderness, hidden among the skeletal trees and snowdrifts, 10 of Germany's finest marksmen were hunting him. 10 rifles, 10 scopes, 10 pairs of eyes trained on the American lines. And Hargrove knew something they didn't, that in the next 3 minutes one of them would make a mistake that would cost them all their lives. If this story already has you hooked, hit that subscribe button, because what happens next will leave you speechless. The Battle of the Bulge had transformed the Ardennes into a frozen hell. Hitler's desperate gamble, a massive counteroffensive aimed at splitting Allied forces and recapturing the vital port of Antwerp, had caught American troops woefully unprepared. The 106th Infantry Division, green and untested, found itself bearing the brunt of 3 German panzer armies crashing through the fog-shrouded forest like steel avalanches. Towns fell, units scattered, communications broke down. And in that chaos, something darker emerged from the German lines. They called them Sharpschützen, sharpshooters trained in the brutal schools of the Eastern Front, where a sniper's life expectancy was measured in days, and only the most ruthless survived. These weren't ordinary soldiers. They were ghosts who could read terrain like poetry, who understood wind and distance with mathematical precision, who could wait motionless for hours until that one perfect moment presented itself. And now a team of 10 such men had been deployed with a singular mission: destroy American morale by eliminating officers, medics, and anyone who dared show leadership. Hargrove was none of those things. He was a farm boy from Nebraska, a deer hunter who'd grown up tracking whitetail through cornfields, who knew the patience required to outweight a wary buck. The Army had recognized his natural shooting ability during basic training and assigned him to scout sniper duties. But he'd never considered himself special. He was just a soldier doing his job, trying to survive long enough to see his girl back home, to walk those cornfields again under a sky that wasn't filled with artillery smoke. But that morning, everything changed. His unit, what remained of Baker Company after 3 days of relentless German assault, held a strategic crossroads outside the Belgian village of Rocheroth. The position was vital. If the Germans took it, they'd have a clear route to the fuel dumps at Stavelot, and without fuel, Patton's tanks would be useless. The entire counteroffensive would collapse. Captain Morrison had been explicit: hold this position at any cost. The German snipers arrived with the dawn, though nobody saw them come. The first sign was Corporal Jenkins, a radio man who stood up to adjust the antenna wire and never finished the motion. The crack of the rifle came a full second after his body crumpled. Then it was Private O'Malley, shot through the helmet while retrieving ammunition. Then Sergeant Davis, killed while trying to reach a wounded man. 3 shots, 3 kills, and each from a different angle, a different distance, and panic rippled through the American lines like electricity. Men pressed themselves into frozen mud, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. The snipers were systematically dismantling the company's ability to function, killing anyone who tried to coordinate, anyone who showed initiative, anyone who represented order in the chaos. Captain Morrison crawled to Hargrove's position, his face grim. "We've got multiple shooters out there, son, professional hunters. They're picking us apart piece by piece, and we can't even see them to shoot back." He paused, snow collecting on his shoulders. "You're the best shot we have. I need you to find them. I need you to stop them." Would you have accepted that mission, knowing that out there in that frozen forest, 10 expert killers were waiting, watching, ready to put a bullet through your skull the moment you revealed yourself? Hargrove didn't hesitate. He'd seen good men die that morning, friends who'd shared cigarettes and stories about home, who'd promised to meet up after the war for beers and baseball games. He nodded once, his jaw set. "Yes, sir, I'll get them." What Morrison didn't tell him, what nobody could tell him, was that this wasn't just about marksmanship. This was psychological warfare at its most intimate. Sniper duels were chess matches played at lethal speed, where one mistake, one moment of impatience or pride meant death. The Germans held every advantage. They'd chosen their positions hours ago. They knew the terrain, they had superior optics, and they outnumbered him 10-1. But Hargrove had something they didn't, something bred into him from years of hunting the endless Nebraska plains. He understood emptiness. He understood how to become nothing, how to let the landscape swallow him until he was just another shadow, another snowdrift, another tree stump. And, more importantly, he understood prey behavior, the subtle kells that gave away position and intent. He began by doing nothing. For 2 full hours, Hargrove lay motionless in his foxhole, not scanning with his scope, not adjusting his position, barely breathing. He let the forest speak to him. He listened to the wind patterns, noting how they shifted and eddied around obstacles. He watched the snow fall, observing where it accumulated and where it didn't, revealing the subtle contours of hidden positions. He studied the trees, looking for bark that seemed too uniform, branches that hung at unnatural angles, shadows that were slightly too dark. And slowly, patterns emerged. The German snipers were good, exceptional even, but they were human. They shifted weight occasionally. They brushed snow from their scopes. They communicated with hand signals that created brief movements against the static background. Hargrove counted at least 7, maybe 8 positions, all arranged in an arc covering the American lines with overlapping fields of fire. It was masterful tactical positioning. They'd created a killing zone where no target could move without being exposed to multiple shooters. But there was a problem with their setup, a tiny flaw in their perfect execution. They were positioned to watch the American lines, which meant they had their backs to each other, their attention focused forward. They were hunters, watching prey, confident in their superiority, and that confidence had made them predictable. Hargrove's mind worked through the geometry of the situation. He couldn't engage them one at a time. The moment he fired, every other German sniper would triangulate his muzzle flash and return fire before he could chamber another round. He'd be dead before his first target hit the ground. No, he needed something different, something unexpected, something that would turn their own expertise against them. Then he saw it. About 400 yards out, slightly elevated on a small ridge, a position that overlooked the entire German line. It was currently empty, too exposed to be useful for watching the Americans, but perfect for watching the German positions themselves. If he could reach it undetected, he'd have the angle. But getting there meant crossing open ground under the watch of 10 rifles, any one of which could end him instantly. He waited until midday, when the weak winter sun created the harshest shadows and worst visibility. Then Hargrove did something that seemed insane. He stood up. Not quickly, not obviously, but slowly, incrementally, like ice forming on a pond. Over the course of 20 minutes, he rose from his foxhole 1 millimeter at a time, his movement so gradual that human eyes couldn't register the change. It was a trick he'd learned hunting antelope, creatures with vision sharp enough to spot a hunter's blink from half a mile away. The German snipers never saw him. Their scopes were focused on the American positions, waiting for targets, and Hargrove was between their focus points, existing in a dead zone of attention. Once fully upright, he moved with the wind, timing each step to coincide with gusts that shook the trees and masked any sound. It took him 45 minutes to cross 200 yards. Was this bravery or madness? Could anyone else have possessed the patience, the nerve, to move that slowly while knowing that one wrong step, one premature movement, would result in instant death? When Hargrove finally reached the ridge position, his entire body was shaking, not from fear, but from the sustained muscular tension of moving so deliberately for so long. He settled into the snow, using fallen branches to break up his outline, and finally allowed himself to look through his scope. What he saw took his breath away. From this angle, he could see all of them. 8 German snipers, he'd been right about the count, positioned in a wide arc, each one invisible from the American lines, but clearly visible from his elevated vantage point. They wore white winter camouflage, their rifles wrapped in cloth to eliminate glare, their positions expertly constructed. These men were artists of death, and their canvas was the frozen battlefield below. Hargrove studied them, watching their patterns, noting how they communicated. The one in the center, positioned behind a fallen log approximately 300 yards out, seemed to be the spotter, the team leader. He used hand signals to coordinate the others, pointing out targets, directing fire. Take him out, and the others would be disorganized, confused. But Hargrove wasn't thinking about taking him out. He was thinking about something far more audacious, something that probably couldn't work, something that violated every principle of sniper doctrine he'd been taught. He was thinking about how to use a single bullet to eliminate the entire team. The temperature was dropping, he noted, which meant the air was becoming denser. His bullet would fly slightly lower. The wind was consistent, roughly 5 miles per hour from the east, which meant he'd need to aim a fraction left of target. Distance to the team leader, 312 yards by his estimation. Well within his rifle's effective range, but this shot wasn't about hitting the target. It was about what happened after. Hargrove chambered around, the metallic click seeming impossibly loud in the frozen silence. He settled his breathing, slowing his heart rate, entering that state of absolute calm that separated expert marksmen from merely good ones. Through his scope, he could see the German team leader adjusting his own rifle, completely unaware that he was being watched, that across that snowy expanse, justice was being calculated in fractions of inches and seconds. The shot had to be perfect, not just accurate, but perfectly placed. Hargrove aimed not at the man's head or chest, but at something specific, the metal scope mounted on his rifle. It was a tiny target, barely 4 inches across, and hitting it at this distance would require not just skill, but a measure of providence. If he missed by even an inch, the bullet would pass harmlessly by, and he'd have revealed his position for nothing. He exhaled slowly, letting his breath out in a controlled stream, his finger applying pressure to the trigger with surgical precision. The Springfield kicked against his shoulder, the report echoing across the forest like divine judgment. And in that frozen instant, everything changed. The bullet struck the German scope with such force that it exploded in a shower of glass and metal fragments. But physics doesn't stop there. The impact at that angle and velocity fragmented the scope's metal housing into dozens of pieces of shrapnel that blasted backward into the sniper's face with devastating effect. But the bullet itself continued, deflected, but still lethal, tumbling end over end as it passed through the team leader's position and struck the sniper positioned directly behind him, piercing his shoulder. The effect was instantaneous pandemonium. The team leader collapsed, screaming, his face shredded by scope fragments, blinded and maimed. The second sniper dropped his rifle, clutching his shoulder, blood spraying across white snow. And the remaining 6 snipers, these veterans of the Eastern Front, these ghosts who'd survived years of the most brutal warfare in human history, made the fatal mistake of assuming they were under assault from multiple shooters. They broke position. They moved, they exposed themselves. And waiting in the American lines were 73 rifles that had been silent for hours, held by men who'd been watching friends die, who'd been pinned down by an enemy they couldn't see. The moment those German snipers moved, Every American soldier with a line of sight opened fire. The snow erupted with muzzle flashes and tracer rounds. The German snipers, caught in the open, repositioning, thinking they were maneuvering away from a threat, ran directly into a wall of American lead. Every 4 minutes of this battle must have felt like an eternity, but in those final seconds, justice was measured in heartbeats. Within 30 seconds, it was over. 6 more German snipers lay dead or dying in the snow. The 2 wounded survivors, seeing their entire team decimated, crawled toward German lines trailing blood and despair. They would survive to tell the story, to report back that the Americans had used some kind of devastating new tactic, that they'd been ambushed by superior forces with extraordinary coordination. But it wasn't coordination. It wasn't superior forces. It was one man, one rifle, one perfectly placed shot that turned expertise into vulnerability, confidence into chaos. Hargrove had understood something fundamental about his enemies, that they were too good, too professional, too confident in their own superiority. They'd positioned themselves perfectly to hunt Americans, but they'd never considered that they might become the hunted. When Hargrove finally returned to American lines 2 hours later, moving with the same glacial patience he'd used to leave, Captain Morrison just stared at him, trying to comprehend what had happened. The German sniper threat that had paralyzed an entire company, that had killed 6 men and wounded a dozen more, had been eliminated by a single soldier they'd never even seen. "How?" Morrison finally asked, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and relief. Hargrove thought about those deer back home in Nebraska, about how you had to understand your quarry to outsmart it, about how sometimes the best shot isn't the most obvious one. "I just gave them something to react to, sir. They did the rest themselves." But it was more than that, wasn't it? It was understanding that skill can become a weakness when it breeds overconfidence. It was recognizing that the strongest position can be the most vulnerable when attacked from an unexpected angle. It was knowing that sometimes courage isn't about facing your enemy head-on, but about having the patience to wait for that one perfect moment when everything aligns. Would you have had the clarity of mind to see that opportunity, the nerve to attempt a shot that, by all rights, shouldn't have worked? The faith in your own abilities to bet your life and the lives of your brothers in arms on a single bullet? The story of Daniel Hargrove's impossible shot spread through the American lines like wildfire during that bitter December. In a battle defined by desperate defense, by terrible losses and uncertain outcomes, here was proof that American ingenuity and courage could overcome even the most skilled enemies. It became one of those stories soldiers told each other during long, cold nights, a reminder that no matter how bad things got, one determined individual could still change everything. Hargrove himself received the Silver Star for his actions that day, though he rarely spoke about it afterward. To him, it wasn't about the medal or the recognition. It was about Corporal Jenkins and Private O'Malley and Sergeant Davies, good men who deserved to make it home, whose lives had been taken by an enemy that struck from the shadows. It was about making sure their deaths meant something, that the crossroads they died defending stayed in American hands. And it did. Baker Company held that position for 3 more days against overwhelming German assault, buying precious time for Allied forces to regroup and mount a counteroffensive that would eventually throw back Hitler's last great gamble. Historians would later identify the defense of Rocheroth as one of the crucial stands that prevented the German breakthrough, that kept fuel supplies secure, that allowed Patton's armor to maneuver effectively. Thousands of lives were saved because one company held one crossroads against impossible odds. At the heart of that stand was a single shot fired by a Nebraska farm boy who understood patience and snow and the way light plays tricks at distance. A shot that shouldn't have worked, that violated doctrine and logic, that succeeded not through conventional tactics, but through understanding both the terrain and the enemy's psychology. The German sniper team was later identified as members of the 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division's Special Reconnaissance Unit, among the most elite marksmen in the Wehrmacht, with a combined kill count that likely exceeded 300 Allied soldiers. They'd fought at Cassino, at Normandy, across the Eastern Front. They were survivors, experts, legends in their own right. And they'd all been undone by a single American soldier they never saw coming. That's the nature of warfare at its most personal level. Technology matters, numbers matter, strategy matters, but sometimes in those crucial moments when history pivots on a knife's edge, it comes down to individuals, their courage, their creativity, their willingness to risk everything on an idea that probably won't work but just might be crazy enough to succeed. Hargrove survived the Battle of the Bulge, survived the war, and returned to Nebraska where he raised crops and children and rarely spoke about that frozen day in December 1944. He passed away in 1992, having lived a long, quiet life far removed from the frozen forests and rifle fire. But his legacy endures in the story of how one American soldier, outnumbered and outgunned, used ingenuity and patience to turn a desperate situation into an improbable victory. These stories remind us why courage matters, and why freedom was never free. It was purchased with the blood and bravery of individuals who, when faced with impossible odds, found the strength to do what needed to be done. Hargrove didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself as a soldier, doing his duty, trying to protect his brothers, trying to make it home. But that's what heroism looks like in its truest form. Ordinary people rising to meet extraordinary circumstances, not for glory or recognition, but because someone had to, and they happened to be there. Subscribe now and join us again for more untold tales of World War II, stories of the individuals whose courage, sacrifice, and ingenuity shaped history and defended the freedoms we often take for granted.